Why We Get the Wrong Politicians. Isabel Hardman, Atlantic Books, 2019. Many useful tips to better understand the life of a British politician. Think about the consequences that politics has on our lives. Get a closer look inside the world of Westminster. The author, Isabel Hardman, is an English political journalist. She works as an editor for The Spectator, a weekly publication on politics, culture and news. Hardman presents The Week in Westminster on BBC Radio 4. In 2015, the Political Studies Association voted her Journalist of the Year. This association develops and promotes political study. She currently lives in London. Identikit of a parliamentarian. Middle-aged white man from the elite upper classes of British society. He has studied in a prestigious college, likely to be Eton, and he is able to spend tens of thousands of pounds on his own money on an electoral campaign. He has very often had a dysfunctional upbringing. More often than not, he is incapable of fulfilling the role that has been assigned to him, because he has been selected by a committee from his party that blindly follows directives from a higher command, without actually checking the competency of the subject in question. The presence of women in Parliament is currently very low. Women are most certainly disadvantaged. If they have a family, they are looked upon unfavourably. If they are single, they are viewed with suspicion. How does one become a Member of Parliament? The first important step is to ally yourself to a political party and be actively committed, participating in events, conferences and banquets. Then you need to be selected by an appointed committee as a local candidate for your party. Then go on to win your local election and the seat of your constituency. You don't necessarily need to be rich to get into politics, but it certainly does help. Applying for Parliament involves an enormous waste of time, money and energy. Even on a personal and family level, the cost is high. Many times the price to pay is the loss of a partner. In the selection interviews, questions are asked to understand how the candidate intends to carry out the electoral campaign, not to verify whether he can be a good legislator, and if he will be able to manage the amount of work once he enters Parliament. A candidate's job is to make sure that as many people as possible know his name and his party. Parties set objectives in terms of how many voters to contact and how many mentions in the local print media. Working in Westminster, the traumatic impact of another world. The term that is used to describe the isolation from the political world and its lack of comprehension of the needs of its electorate is the Westminster bubble. A new member that steps into this bubble is shocked by several factors. The vastness of Westminster. Inside, literally everything can be found. Months can go by before you actually get a private office in which to work. There is no formal documentation on how to carry out the various activities the job entails. Parliament is a dysfunctional place. You can spend hours and hours discussing something and appear very busy without actually getting anything done. The sudden and continuous media exposure. The language of the House of Commons is difficult to understand for a newly elected MP. You can make faces, emit the strangest sounds, wave papers, but you are not allowed to applaud to show your approval. It is considered offensive. The general atmosphere of the chamber during the Prime Minister's questions, when the PM replies to parliamentary questions every Wednesday. There are screams, gestures, and a level of confusion that is enough to upset anyone. Leaving the bubble, work in the constituencies. MPs are engaged on two fronts: legislation and service in the places where they are elected. They spend much of their time listening to and solving the problems of ordinary people within their constituencies during the weekly reception hours. Being able to meet people and help them is a source of great satisfaction to many of them, even if it is an activity that is scarcely considered and published by the media. Here a question comes to mind. Wouldn't it be better if these politicians devoted more time to legislative activity, guaranteeing the country good laws that can improve people's lives? If they did so, wouldn't there consequently be fewer problems to be solved at a local level, and therefore less time needed to be spent on the local constituencies? Wouldn't everything run more smoothly? A parliamentarian cannot be a good legislator. For 4 days a week, members are in Westminster to carefully scrutinise proposed laws. In actual fact, they do nothing but obey the directives of the party leaders on the positions to be held. It is simply a well-organised theatre in which there are those who use the time to write greetings cards and reply to emails instead of paying attention and joining in the debate. Very often, MPs do not even know the content of the laws that they are voting for. There is no need for them to be excellent legislators. They need to know how to keep themselves out of trouble. Better to attract public attention by participating in senseless parliamentary activities than to scrupulously examine the laws. It is very difficult for a parliamentarian to change a bill once it is presented in Parliament, because the government's ego comes into play, which does not like to admit when it is wrong, even when faced with a bad law. Usually voting against the government means voting against one's career prospects. The real goal: to become a minister. In Parliament, there is no culture that rewards good legislators. Long-sighted MPs aim to be part of the executive, while serious ones who scrupulously scrutinise the laws are seen as eccentrics. Those in politics want to become ministers as soon as possible, for several reasons, such as greater media attention and having more staff on their service, a higher salary, and more career prospects outside the government. For particularly ambitious parliamentarians, the first step towards the executive is to become a minister's private secretary. You don't get paid for this, but if you are lucky, you can gain a better understanding of ministerial work. Politicians are often disappointed once they become ministers. Once the initial excitement has worn off, as with all jobs, the harsh reality kicks in, which means another office to manage, a lot more commitments, and not much more prestige than before. The most important thing for a minister is to always be in the spotlight, to make noise. You have to make yourself heard, always show that you are busy and full of commitments to maintain credibility. Obviously, if you are a woman, the public will scrutinise you with more attention and suspicion, keeping a watchful eye out for any signs of incompetence or inadequacy on your part. The private life of an MP is at risk. Most parliamentarians attribute their separation to the work that they do. One sure way to ruin a marriage is to enter into Parliament. Some decide to move their families to their relevant district, to keep their loved ones away from the chaos of London, and to show the electorate a sense of belonging towards their community. This juggling between different and sometimes distant places can turn stable and happy marriages into something exhausting to keep up with. The MP's work entails many hours of working alone until late at night, often waiting for votes. Usually, to kill time during the wait, they meet for drinks, which is where many extramarital affairs begin. Parliament is notorious for its sex scandals, most notably in 2017, when an exorbitant number of politicians were accused of abuse and harassment. All this is not only a consequence of the endless hours spent in the bubble, but also of the availability of young, brilliant, attractive, and often adoring collaborators who work in the same office as the MP and are always available and highly sensitive to the charm of power. Numerous scandals have revealed the absence of a human resources department. The victims don't know where to turn. They have no one to ask for advice. The negative impact of parliamentary life also impacts on children, who can suffer at school from the comments of classmates and teachers towards the country's most despised working class. A stressful job that can lead to alcoholism and mental illness. One type of relationship that strengthens once you enter Westminster is most certainly the one you have with the bottle, and very few seem immune to this vice. Although measures have been put in place to curb this problem, cameras, family-friendly working hours, the closure of some bars inside Westminster, there is still a long way to go. You drink in the evening to kill time waiting for the vote. You drink at lunch while chatting with a colleague. Alcohol is often a remedy used to treat stress and discomfort. The continued exposure that politicians have to criticism, threats and harassment makes them particularly vulnerable, especially those who are honest and try to do their jobs well. They are people constantly seeking public approval, often suffering from mental disorders. Yet those who have been elected to represent the population in Parliament must be perfectly lucid and in good physical and mental health. For this reason, there is a team of doctors and nurses that MPs can refer to for care and advice. They organise mindfulness courses and behavioural therapy sessions. What happens when you step out of the Westminster bubble? An MP's life isn't easy. It is a job that is best suited to the end of an interesting career, or as an intermediate experience in one's professional life to then move on to more rewarding and fulfilling experiences. Those who leave the House of Commons are usually frustrated and exhausted from the endless days and nights spent at work. They feel as though they have been living on another planet. The main reasons why an MP resigns are age, personal reasons, the desire for change, professional improvement, or falling out of love with politics. Scandals certainly do take their toll. Jolly shopping and sexual abuse, to name a couple, especially for those who are clean and honest. In general, women resign earlier than their male colleagues, mostly because of family. Anyone that goes back to being a politician without a government post feels demoted. This is not something to be proud of in Westminster. They are relegated to a lower-profile job and a less rewarding life. For brilliant and successful people, certainly working life outside the government can be more attractive, and this certainly contributes to the weakening of the House, which is deprived of important resources. Not winning the seat for which you are a candidate is very frustrating. While some publicly rejoice in the victory, there are those who find themselves with the delight of having won, yet ending up out of work. But even safe seats can cease to be safe. Losing your seat can be very traumatic and seriously endanger your mental health. The greatest benefits of no longer being in Parliament can be seen in your private life, when the family feels more relieved and marriages and relationships can get back on track. MPs, an elite class that doesn't understand the needs of the common people. The dysfunctional nature of the British Parliament not only churns out the wrong politicians, but also the wrong laws. Each and every government makes and has made terrible mistakes with devastating consequences, mistakes that continue to be repeated over time. This is not so much due to the fact that politicians are insane, but rather the system itself, which, as a whole, is sick. Parliament is dominated by wealthy, middle-aged men. This homogeneity is the very problem, because people from similar backgrounds with similar experiences will have a single and non-objective point of view on the world around them. The lack of diversity in such a group will struggle to predict and understand the consequences of their policies. The poll tax is the classic example of a tax designed by a homogeneous group of people, analysed and assessed by the same inner circle, which proved to be a huge political disaster, resulting in the fall of the Prime Minister. Westminster seems to have learned nothing from this colossal disaster. In the Grenfell Tower fire of 2017, where 72 people died, politicians had a responsibility, above all, to listen to the inhabitants, both before and after the disaster. But they had more important things to deal with, in their opinion. Unless a topic has a strong political impact, it is difficult to bring attention to it even when it is urgent. In this case, the inhabitants of the skyscraper were not heard, despite the catastrophe being predicted by many. The reality of Grenfell Tower, a social housing block in the middle of a very affluent neighbourhood, was so far from the bubble that it was neither seen nor heard. The tendency to procrastinate. Better to leave the responsibility of the important decisions to someone else. Politicians tend to want to do the right thing for their constituents without being criticised and becoming unpopular. So when it comes to making important decisions, they prefer others to do the dirty work. They don't like to deal with long-term problems for fear of short-term consequences. Ideally, they would like to pursue good policies for the country and to always be admired and appreciated. These two things don't always go hand in hand. Just as it is not easy to solve the problems in constituencies and be good legislators at the same time, no one can serve two masters. And so MPs end up disappointing the most important people, the voters, those who will feel firsthand the consequences of their political choices. Politicians avoid making urgent and necessary choices to avoid disappointing anyone, and they make decisions on useless matters just to show that they are committed to something. They do everything they can to ensure that someone else has to deal with the issues that could make them unpopular. Let's not forget that politicians are elected and paid by the people to make decisions and to be responsible for those decisions. Washing your hands of it and not choosing means not facing up to the very responsibility delegated to them by the voters. Wanting to keep politics out of the way, as many politicians do in order to justify their behaviour and set a certain tone, is not something desirable. Of course, holding on to one's membership for the good of the community in legislating is excellent, but politics is not necessarily evil. It is indeed the designated place for discussion and deliberated choices. An example of the tendency to postpone important decisions. The Palace of Westminster, a UNESCO heritage building, needs urgent repair. Yet politicians fear voters' opinion, especially when it comes to spending, and prefer to procrastinate on this matter. They do not realise that, as a group, they are already despised by the public, whatever they decide. The importance of being a yes man, or obeying orders from above. The least justifiable and most maleficent culture of the House of Commons is that of the yes man. Puppet men who carry out orders from above. They are aware of the inconsistency of their role as legislators and do nothing to change things. An MP has a duty to examine and vote on the laws with competence and sensitivity. Even when the party leaders try to impose their will, the MP must decide independently and take responsibility for their actions. Yes men are extremely intelligent people, often with highly successful careers behind them, but they make the same mistake as everyone else. They neglect the responsibilities of the legislators in favour of a bright career in policy making. The so-called bedroom tax, cut in rent funds, is a good example of how obedient parliamentarians have been able to pass a law not so much to guarantee justice and fairness for the people, but with the specific purpose of allowing the state to save on subsidies for housing. This blatantly disastrous law was only passed because party leaders and the government's ego prevailed over the common sense of lawmakers, to the detriment of voters with financial hardship. Even Brexit can be seen as a sort of litmus test of this tendency to procrastinate, in the hope that the next minister or the next government will deal with it. The trap of a system and a culture that gets in the way of change. Even the most scrupulous and honest lawmakers can get trapped by the Westminster system itself, which forces MPs to become puppets in the hands of the executive. The power that politicians actually have is very little, and this was demonstrated at the time of the Iraq War. When Blair decided to go to war against Iraq, Parliament wanted to further analyse the case, especially the dossier regarding Saddam Hussein's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, and to understand what the plans were for the post-war period. Going to war is not like conducting an electoral campaign. It is something much more complex that must be evaluated and weighed up with the utmost attention. The Westminster structure itself made it impossible for MPs to do their job well, once again falling into the trap of a system that only wants to perpetrate executive power. Quotes. Next time we ask why we get the wrong politicians, perhaps we should ask why any of the right ones want to put themselves in this kind of danger. They are very good at saying that something must be done, and even better at hoping that someone else will end up having to do it. If you have an underlying disposition to a mental illness, which may have never developed, Parliament will ensure that it does develop. Take-home message. Politicians are the least trusted professional category, followed by estate agents, bankers, and journalists. Voters are angry with politicians. They despise them, especially for the expenses and sex scandals. Yet, it is the system itself and the political culture that prevents worthy and competent people from entering the corridors of Westminster, just as the very structure of the government does not allow parliamentarians to do their job as legislators properly.